In the last 8 months of Elvis Presley's life, a mere 232 days, his personal physician prescribed him over 10,000 doses of narcotics, sedatives, and amphetamines, a figure so staggering, so beyond the realm of medicine, that it ceases to be a prescription history and becomes a ledger of a slow, methodical execution. But was this man, Doctor George Nichopoulos, a cold-blooded enabler who orchestrated the king's downfall for the glittering prize of fame and fortune? Or was he the only person on Earth trapped in an impossible paradox, desperately trying to keep a spiraling icon from destroying himself by using a devil's bargain to buy him just one more day, one more song? The story doesn't begin in the maelstrom of the 1970s, with the bloated jumpsuits and the slurred stage patter. It begins a decade earlier, in 1967, in a Memphis that still felt the earth shake under Elvis's feet. The king was back. He was a pillar of fire and coiled leather, reborn and more dangerous than ever. But even then, in the quiet moments between the flashbulbs, the shadows were gathering. The pressure to be more than a man had already taken root. Dr. George Constantine Nichopoulos, known to the world as Dr. Nick, was not a creature of this dazzling, nocturnal world. He was a respected general practitioner, a family man, a Greek-American physician with a solid, unremarkable practice. He entered the gilded cage of Graceland not with a syringe of Demerol, but with a simple remedy for a simple problem. Elvis, an avid horseman, was suffering from saddle sores. It was a house call like any other, a minor ailment for a major celebrity. But inside those walls, nothing was simple. Graceland was a velvet prison, an echo chamber of agreement, where the word no had long been banished from the vocabulary. It was a kingdom ruled by a benevolent, insomniac monarch who demanded absolute loyalty and perpetual motion. The Memphis Mafia, his court of childhood friends and yes-men, orbited him like planets, their entire existence dependent on his gravitational pull. And the king, he was tired, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of sleep could cure, and so he sought his rest in the deep, dreamless abyss of chemistry. He didn't want a doctor. He wanted a provider. The first requests were small, something to help him sleep after the adrenaline of a show, something to get him up for the next one. Dr. Nick, at first, complied with a professional caution, unaware he was taking the first steps into a labyrinth from which there was no exit. He saw a man in pain, a patient whose ailments were not of the flesh, but of the soul. A man who carried the weight of a global myth on his shoulders every waking second. The line between doctor and friend began to dissolve. Then the line between friend and confidant. And finally, the line between confidant and keeper of secrets. This slow, insidious erosion of boundaries was the true sickness. Dr. Nick was given his own room at Graceland. He began traveling with Elvis on tour, his black medical bag a constant, ominous presence backstage. He was no longer just a physician making a house call. He was a permanent resident in the court of the king, a court where the currency was access, and the price of admission was indulgence. The professional boundary wasn't just blurred, it was utterly erased. The relationship became a twisted symbiosis, a dance of dependency that served them both. Elvis found a seemingly legitimate, unending source for the chemical peace he craved, a man in a white coat who could sanitize the ugly reality of his addiction. And Dr. Nick? Perhaps he was starstruck, drawn into the intoxicating orbit of a living legend. Or perhaps he was driven by a savior complex, a sincere, if catastrophically misguided belief that only he could manage the unmanageable. He saw a man who, if left to his own devices, would turn to the back alleys and the street dealers. He believed he was the lesser of two evils. This belief manifested in one of the most bizarre rituals of the king's final years, the creation of the packs. Before each tour, Nick would spend hours in a hotel room, meticulously portioning out Elvis's required medications into small envelopes, a cocktail to wake him up, a cocktail to sustain him through the performance, a cocktail to bring him down into unconsciousness. To an outsider, it looked like the organized inventory of a drug trafficker. But in the doctor's mind, this was control. This was harm reduction. This was him, and only him, standing between Elvis Presley and a dirty needle in a dark room. He was not just a doctor, he was a gatekeeper. Whispers began to snake through the halls of the mansion. Some of the Memphis Mafia, the very men who owed their livelihoods to Elvis, saw the writing on the wall. Red West, a lifelong friend and bodyguard, grew increasingly alarmed, confronting both Elvis and the doctor, his warnings falling on deaf ears. Others were complicit, seeing Drive Nick as the man who kept the show on the road, the man who ensured the paychecks kept coming. Graceland was no longer a home. It was a fractured kingdom, divided by secrets and silent, resentful alliances, all revolving around the king and his doctor. But Nick's had a defense, an argument so audacious, so contrary to every standard of medical ethics, that it was either the desperate rationalization of a guilty man or a glimpse into a radical, unsung attempt to save a life. He claimed it was all a placebo, a grand deception, a psychological war waged with sugar pills and saline injections. He argued that Elvis's addiction was not merely chemical, but psychological. The king was addicted to the ritual, the act of taking something, the gesture of seeking relief from a bottle or a syringe. Dr. Nick insisted that for every real dose of a powerful drug he was forced to administer, he would substitute countless fakes. He would give Elvis injections of sterile water, telling him it was a painkiller. He would hand him capsules filled with inert powder, promising they would help him sleep. He wasn't feeding an addiction, he claimed. He was managing a fiction. Imagine the scene. A nightly drama played out in hotel suites across America. The king, a mountain of a man, his eyes clouded with a paranoid haze, convinced he couldn't go on stage without a fix. He trusts one man. Dr. Nick, the physician, steps into the role of a performer himself. He fills a syringe with saline solution, his voice calm, reassuring, authoritative. He tells Elvis this is what he needs, a powerful European painkiller that will see him through the show. He administers the shot. Elvis feels the prick of the needle, the liquid entering his system. His mind, conditioned and desperate, does the rest. The anxiety subsides. The pain miraculously fades. The king is ready for his subjects. In those moments, George Nichopoulos was not a doctor. He was a magician, a master of misdirection. He was locked in a high-stakes psychological chess match with the most famous man in the world, a man whose reality was already warped by fame and isolation. The doctor believed he was winning, holding the line against a complete and total collapse, one sugar pill at a time. It was a dangerous, unprecedented strategy, a secret therapy session played out with props and lies. But the fiction had a fatal flaw. For every placebo he claimed to use, a very real paper trail was growing. A trail that told a different story. While Nick was supposedly weaning Elvis off his dependencies, he was simultaneously writing thousands of prescriptions for narcotics and amphetamines under a constellation of false names. The prescriptions were written for Elvis's cousin, his father, his road manager, his girlfriend. The names on the bottles changed. The destination was always the same. This was the machinery of the addiction. A clandestine operation hidden in plain sight. It involved late-night runs to multiple pharmacies across Memphis, a deliberate strategy to avoid raising suspicion at any single location. It required the complicity of the inner circle, who would be dispatched to pick up packages under their own names, becoming unwitting, or perhaps unwilling, cogs in the system. The scale of it was industrial. In 1976 alone, Nick procured more than 11,500 pills for the Graceland fortress. The pressure on Dr. Nick must have been immense. The king's demands were relentless. A constant, around-the-clock need that respected no boundaries of time or professional ethics. A phone call at 3 a.m. was not a request. It was a summons. Was the doctor trapped by his own compassion? Afraid that if he said no, Elvis would die? Or had he become an addict himself? Not to the drugs, but to the power, to the intoxicating thrill of being the one man the king of rock and roll could not live without? The world had shrunk to the size of a pill bottle, and the world was beginning to take notice. The Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners did not begin its investigation after Elvis Presley's body was found on the floor of his bathroom. The alarm bells had been ringing for years. As early as 1975, pharmacists in Memphis, their professional ethics pushed to the breaking point by the sheer volume and frequency of the prescriptions, began to file complaints. Anonymous tips flowed in, painting a picture of a doctor who had become the personal apothecary to a dangerously dependent star. The net was closing in, but the king's shadow was long, and his influence provided a shield. Dr. Nick was questioned. He was investigated. He used his charisma and his carefully constructed arguments about placebos and harm reduction to deflect and delay. He argued that his patient was extraordinary, and therefore required extraordinary, unconventional methods of care. He managed to keep the authorities at bay, but the scrutiny intensified. He had to be more careful. The web of aliases grew more complex. The late-night pharmacy runs became more frantic, more secretive. While the state of Tennessee was investigating the doctor, the state of Elvis Presley was deteriorating in the most public way imaginable. The 1977 tours were a heartbreaking spectacle. He was a ghost of himself, a parody of the legend. He slurred his words, forgot his lyrics, and struggled through performances that left audiences stunned and saddened. On stage in Rapid City, South Dakota, just 2 months before his death, his decline was so obvious, so painful, that it felt like a public cry for help. Everyone could see the king was dying, and the man tasked with keeping him alive was now fighting to save his own career. The two narratives, the slow death of an icon and the slow collapse of a doctor's reputation, were on a collision course, speeding towards an inevitable, tragic conclusion. On a sweltering August morning in Memphis, the day before the world would stop, Nichopoulos received a phone call. It wasn't the king. It was a cold, unfamiliar voice on the other end of the line, a man who identified himself as an investigator for the medical board. He wasn't calling about old complaints or past suspicions. He was calling about a single prescription, filled just the night before. A prescription for gilded, a potent opioid, written under the name of one of Elvis's roadies. The investigator had a simple, direct question. He wanted to know exactly who that prescription was for, and why the dosage was large enough to fell a man twice Elvis's size. Dr. Nick felt a chill creep up his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He offered a practiced explanation, a story about stocking the medical kit for the upcoming tour, but the investigator's silence on the other end of the line was heavy, accusatory. The walls were no longer closing in. They had finally touched. He hung up the phone, the silence of the room now deafening. He looked at his hands. The same hands that had held the trust of the most famous man on the planet. For the first time, he truly understood that the game was over. He was no longer the gatekeeper. He was a suspect. His own secrets were now a terminal diagnosis, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was running out of time. His own secrets were now a terminal diagnosis, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was running out of time. But what if the game was bigger than he was? What if he wasn't the only player? As the echo of the dead phone line filled his office, a different kind of fear took hold. It wasn't just the fear of exposure, of losing his license, of prison. It was the fear of failure on a scale he couldn't bear to comprehend. He grabbed the phone again, his fingers fumbling with the rotary dial, and made a call not to his lawyer, but to Graceland itself. To Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager. His voice was a raw whisper, stripped of all its usual confidence. "Joe," he said, the word catching in his throat. "They know. But they're looking at the wrong prescription. You have to check his stash. You have to find out what he got last night. I think he went somewhere else." There was a pause. Confusion on the other end of the line. "But, drive," Nick was insistent. "The dentist, Joe. Did he see the dentist?" The question hung in the air, a bombshell that reframes the entire tragedy. For years, the story has been a simple, damning duet between a vulnerable star and a compromised doctor. But that was never the whole truth. The machinery of Elvis Presley's addiction wasn't run by a single man. It was a syndicate. Dr. Nick wasn't the sole gatekeeper. He was just the most visible one, the court physician. But there were other purveyors in the kingdom, each with their own prescription pad, each with their own justification. Chief among them was a man who worked not on the body but on the mouth. Drive. Lester Hoffman, Elvis's personal dentist. On the surface, it made sense. Elvis had terrible teeth, a lifelong problem that required constant, painful work. Dr. Hoffman was there to manage that pain. But his role, like Dr. Nick's, began to bleed beyond its professional boundaries. The prescriptions for codeine, for Percodan, started to flow with a frequency that had little to do with root canals. He became another stop on the late-night circuit, another source to be tapped when the primary well ran dry. This created a nightmare scenario for Dr. Nick. He saw himself as the reluctant manager of a controlled demolition, carefully measuring out doses, using placebos, trying to keep the king functional. But how could he control the intake when there was a second, unregulated supply line pouring poison into the same system? It was like trying to treat a patient for alcoholism, while another doctor was secretly leaving bottles of whiskey on his doorstep. The two men were locked in a strange, unspoken rivalry, with the king's life as the prize. Elvis, a master manipulator of the people around him, learned to play them against each other. If Dr. Nick resisted a request, the threat was always there, unspoken but deafening. "Fine, I'll just call Drive. Hoffman, my tooth is really hurting today." It was a form of emotional and medical blackmail. Who could say no? To refuse was to risk Elvis turning to a less cautious, less knowledgeable source, and potentially taking a fatal combination of drugs. So Drive, Nick would relent. He'd write the prescription, not because he wanted to, but because he was terrified of what would happen if he didn't. He was trying to be the only dealer on the block, not for profit but for a twisted kind of safety. His 11,000 pills in a single year seems monstrous, until you ask the truly terrifying question: How many was he trying to prevent Elvis from taking from other, more reckless sources? The network was bigger even than Memphis. In Las Vegas, there was Dr. Elias Ghanem. In Palm Springs, a constellation of other physicians. When Elvis was on the road, or on vacation, new doctors would be brought into the fold, charmed by the celebrity, perhaps intimidated by the entourage, and always willing to write a script to help the king get through the night. Each one was a wild card, a variable drive Nick couldn't control. This explains the travel packs drive Nick so meticulously prepared before each tour. The official story, his defense, was that they were pre-planned, controlled doses for specific ailments on the road. But now, they look like something else entirely. They look like an attempt to flood the market, to provide Elvis with such an overwhelming, pre-approved supply from his trusted doctor that he wouldn't be tempted to go doctor shopping in a new city. It was a desperate, paradoxical strategy to give a man a mountain of drugs in order to save him from a mountain of drugs. And all this time, the medical board in Tennessee was closing in, their focus fixed entirely on one man, George Nichopoulos. They saw the thousands of prescriptions from his pen, the web of aliases, the frantic pharmacy runs. They saw a rogue doctor, a legal drug pusher. They didn't see the shadow war he was fighting, or at least the one he told himself he was fighting. The investigators' call on August 15th wasn't random. It was the culmination of that long, painstaking investigation. They had him. That prescription for Dilaudid was the final nail. But while they were meticulously building their case against Drive, Nick, they were missing the immediate, lethal danger that was gathering like a storm cloud just hours away. A danger that had nothing to do with that Dilaudid prescription. At around 10:30 p.m. on the night of August 15th, 1977, less than 12 hours before his body would be discovered, Elvis Presley did something unusual. He made a late-night visit to his dentist, Drive Lester Hoffman. The official reason was to have a temporary filling replaced. He was accompanied by his girlfriend, Ginger Alden, and his cousin, Billy Smith. He was in and out in under an hour. He left with a prescription. Publicly, it was said to be for a handful of codeine tablets for the pain. But was that all he left with? Was it just codeine? Or was this the moment the fatal dose was acquired? The moment a cocktail of depressants from Dr. Hoffman's pad was added to the cocktail of stimulants and narcotics already coursing through his system from Dr. Nick's supply? This is the missing piece of the puzzle. The variable that no one, not even the ever-present Drive, Nick, could account for. When Elvis returned to Graceland that night, he was carrying medications from at least 2 different doctors. Dr. Nick had already sent over his pre-tour package, a carefully curated selection of pills meant to get Elvis to sleep and ready for the flight to Portland, Maine. The packets were labeled by the hour: 11 p.m., 1 a.m., 3 a.m., 5 a.m., a regimen designed for control. But now, a new, unknown quantity had been introduced into the equation. In his final hours, Elvis was a walking, talking pharmaceutical experiment. He had uppers to get him going, downers to bring him down, painkillers for his body, and God knows what for the pain in his soul. Dr. Nick's carefully constructed schedule was meaningless if Elvis decided to supplement it with a handful of something else from the dentist. And on that final night, his tooth really was bothering him. He was tired. He was anxious about the tour. He wanted relief. He wanted oblivion. The phone call Drive Nick made to Joe Esposito that morning was more than a panicked attempt to save himself. It was a moment of horrifying clarity. As he stood in his office, the medical board's accusation ringing in his ears, he realized the monster he had been trying to tame had broken its leash and wandered into a different cage, one kept by a different zookeeper. The prescription the investigator was asking about was a ghost. The real killer was likely another prescription, one Drive Nick had no knowledge of, written by a man whose name wasn't even on the investigator's file. He had spent years walking a tightrope, convincing himself that his complicity was a form of care, that he was the only thing standing between Elvis and a certain messy death. He had sacrificed his reputation, his ethics, and his peace of mind to be the king's personal pharmacist. And in the end, it didn't matter. The system was too big, the appetite too vast. He was just one supplier among many. His control was an illusion. The entire placebo defense, the harm reduction strategy, it was all a lie he told the world. But more importantly, a lie he told himself. Because the alternative was to admit that he was simply a man who couldn't say no. Now, he was trapped. If he told the investigators about Dr. Hoffman, it would sound like a desperate, pathetic attempt to shift blame. It wasn't my drugs that killed him. It was the other doctor's drugs. Who would believe that? It was the pathetic cry of a guilty man. He was the one who wrote thousands of prescriptions. He was the one who created the infrastructure of addiction. His signature was on the pharmacy logs that stretched back for years. The paper trail led to his door, and on August 16, 1977, the entire world would come knocking. Wild Drive. Nick sat in his office, paralyzed by the certainty of his own ruin. Life at Graceland went on. The final preparations for the tour were underway. Bags were being packed. Cars were being readied. The plan was for Elvis to wake up in the late afternoon, and for the entire caravan to head for the airport to board his private jet, the Lisa Marie. There was a schedule to keep, a concert to perform, an image to maintain. The king was resting, preparing to once again go out and conquer his kingdom. But upstairs, in the quiet sanctuary of his private bathroom, the chemical war that had been raging inside him for a decade was reaching its final, silent, catastrophic conclusion. The cocktails from the different doctors, the uppers and the downers, were having one last, fatal conversation in his bloodstream. But that conversation was about to be interrupted. The first person to discover the scene was not a doctor, or a bodyguard, or an assistant. It was his girlfriend, Ginger Alden. After waking and realizing Elvis wasn't in bed, she knocked on the bathroom door. When there was no answer, she pushed it open. The sight that met her eyes would become an infamous tableau of rock and roll tragedy. The king, face down on the shag carpet, his body already cool, his colorful pajama bottoms bunched around his knees. Her scream was the starting pistol for the last great race of Elvis Presley's life, the race to control the story of his death. And here is where the official narrative, the one you think you know, begins to fracture. Because the first instinct of those who heard that scream was not to call for an ambulance. It was to call for backup. The first calls made from that upstairs sanctuary were not to 911. They were internal. To Joe Esposito. To Al Strada. To the lieutenants of the Memphis Mafia. Why? What could possibly be more important than getting paramedics to the side of a dying man? The answer is as simple as it is chilling. Preserving the myth. Before any outside medical professional was allowed into that room, the inner circle was activated. They weren't just friends rushing to a potential tragedy. They were a crisis management team, executing a protocol they had likely rehearsed in their minds 100 times. This was the moment they all dreaded, the one they had all profited from delaying. And their first job was not resuscitation. It was sanitation. They were cleaning the scene. But what, exactly, were they cleaning up? Were they just hiding the sheer scale of the prescription drug use to protect his image? Or were they hiding something more specific? A piece of evidence that pointed not to a long, slow decline, but to a single, fatal mistake made in the final hours? Think about it. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, a heart attack, a clean, almost respectable end for a man of his age and lifestyle. But the paramedics who finally arrived on the scene told a different story. They described a scene that was anything but clean. They saw a body that showed clear signs of having been gone for hours, not minutes. They saw a level of rigor and lividity that made their frantic CPR attempts a hopeless, ghoulish pantomime. They were working on a man who was long past saving. So why the delay in calling them? What happened in that critical window of time between Ginger's scream and the ambulance's arrival? This missing time is the black hole at the center of the Elvis Presley death investigation. This is the moment when the truth became malleable. It's in these minutes that the small, unlabeled bottle from Dr. Hoffman's dental office could have vanished forever. It's when any notes Elvis might have written, any stray pills he might have dropped, any clues to his final state of mind could have been scooped up and erased from history. The men cleaning the scene weren't just protecting a king's reputation, they were protecting their own. They were the enablers, the facilitators, the ones who procured the doctors and filled the prescriptions. An unvarnished scene could have implicated them all. The narrative had to be controlled. The cause of death had to be his heart, his genetics, his southern diet. Anything but the system they had all helped to build and maintain around him. And so, the perfect scapegoat was already in place. Dr. Nick. While the Memphis Mafia was erasing evidence at Graceland Drive, Nick was miles away, oblivious. A lamb being led to the slaughter he had inadvertently helped construct. The phone call he received from Joe Esposito was not a simple cry for help. It was the first step in a carefully orchestrated campaign to assign blame. The cover-up at Graceland ensured that when the world came looking for a villain, all roads would lead to one man's prescription pad. The thousands of pills he had prescribed over the years were the perfect smokescreen, a massive bonfire of evidence that could distract from the single, fatal ember that might have come from somewhere else entirely. But there's a deeper, more unsettling possibility to consider. What if the evidence being removed wasn't just about pill bottles and prescriptions? What if it was about intent? For years, Elvis had flirted with oblivion. He had a profound interest in spirituality, death, and the afterlife. He would read books on the subject for hours. He would talk to his friends about what lay beyond. Was the final dose an accident? A groggy miscalculation in the middle of the night? Or was it something else? A final, desperate attempt to reach a different plane of existence? An act not of self-destruction but of self-transcendence? We may never know. The men who were in that room are either gone or forever bound by a code of silence. They created a story on that hot August morning. A story of a tragic heart attack that robbed the world of its king. It was a simple, clean story, and it pointed the finger squarely at Doctor George Nichopoulos, the man who had loved Elvis, who had tried to control his habits, and who had ultimately failed. The complexity of Elvis's own role in his demise, the shared responsibility of his entire inner circle, and the mystery of that final prescription from the dentist, all of it was wiped clean, like condensation from a mirror, leaving only the reflection of a single, guilty man. The stage was now set for one of the most sensational medical trials in American history. But the star witness, the truth itself, had already been ushered out the back door. And so the trial of Dr. George Nichopoulos became the final act in a tragedy written by many hands. It was a public spectacle designed to provide a simple answer to a devastatingly complex question. While the world debated the ethics of one doctor, the more uncomfortable truths remained locked away in the collective memory of the Memphis Mafia, buried under a mountain of carefully constructed myth. The story of Elvis Presley's death is not just the story of a man who died, it's the story of how a legend is preserved. For the myth of the king to endure, the man had to be simplified. His death couldn't be a messy tapestry of addiction, spiritual searching, enabling, and profound loneliness. It needed a villain. It needed a clean ending. The heart of a king simply gave out. It's a story fit for a legend. But the truth, as it so often is for the man. In the end, what was truly lost in that upstairs bathroom wasn't just a life. It was clarity. The sanitization of the scene was the sanitization of his story. It protected an image at the cost of understanding the human being behind it. And that is why we are still haunted by it. Decades later, we sense the missing pieces. We feel the pull of that black hole in the narrative. The minutes that were erased. The questions that were never asked. The official story is a neatly printed page. But the truth is in the margins, in the whispers, in the silences. The story of Elvis didn't end on August 16, 1977. In many ways, that's where the most compelling chapter begins. It's a story of legacy, of memory, and the eternal search for the truth behind the larger-than-life reflection we thought we knew. His music made him immortal, but his story makes him human. To keep searching for that man, to piece together the stories that were silenced, and to explore every chapter of his incredible life and enduring legacy, subscribe to Forever_Elvis_Stories. Because the music never stops, and neither do